All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I am Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion of U.S.-Iran relations in the Biden administration. Today's session is the fourth in a series that we have been putting on at CNAS, looking at the national security implications of the political change in Washington. And we should actually expand the title of today's session slightly, since we'll discuss not only U.S. policy toward Iran in the new administration, but also what may transpire over the remaining 40 days of the transition. The timeliness of the discussion, I think, is highlighted by the recent killing of Iran's top nuclear scientists, and then the approval by Iran's parliament of a bill that would require the government to increase uranium enrichment and suspend UN inspections if sanctions relief is not in the offing. So we'll talk about some of those things as well, but there are things moving almost as we speak on the U.S.-Iran file. So to unpack these developments and their implications for American policy toward Iran, we've got a great group of speakers with us today. Rob Malley is CEO of International Crisis Group, and he served as White House coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region for President Obama, in addition to a number of other senior positions handling Middle East affairs and government. Ilan Goldenberg is the director of CNAS's Middle East Security Program. He served as Iran team chief at the Pentagon, among other positions. Elisa Catalano Ewers is an adjunct senior fellow at CNAS in our Middle East program, and she was director for the Middle East on the NSC staff. And Kaleigh Thomas is associate fellow in the CNAS Middle East program and is the 2020 recipient of the Basevich Award. So we've got a great group. As we've done in the previous sessions in this series, we'll start with a conversation among us, then we'll move to some audience questions, which you can enter in the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll get to some of those. And we'll also have a few polling questions from that Shai Corman, aka DJ Shai, will sort of heat up for us, and we'll weave those in throughout so we can get a sense for what the audience thinks about some of the key questions. So thanks to everybody for joining us. And Rob, let me start with you and start with the news of the day. Iran's top nuclear scientist assassinated last week, allegedly by the Israelis, although there hasn't been a public denial or claim of responsibility. There's been a lot of speculation that this may be aimed at killing the nuclear diplomacy, making it more difficult for the Biden administration to re-engage, to go back into the JCPOA, or something else. And so maybe we can start by, how do you see the fallout from that? And does this really affect the choices that the Biden administration will have, particularly on the nuclear file when they come into office?
So first, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here and with all your colleagues, in particular Elisa, with who I work closely at the NSC. So it's great to see her again. Listen, I'd start by saying I think everyone right now, whether it's Israel, whether it's Iran, whether it's the Trump administration itself, in some way is directly or indirectly speaking to the Biden administration and trying to either put in a box, force its hand, or complicate its task ahead. That's certainly the case of the flurry of sanctions that the Trump administration has announced that it's has and will continue to impose on Iran, with the barely concealed intent of making it harder for Biden administration to come back into the JCPOA. You know, the assassination of the nuclear scientist, top nuclear scientist, you could read it in different ways. Some level, it's why not, from an Israeli perspective, if in fact they were behind it, why not hurt Iran's nuclear program and show other nuclear scientists, anyone who's involved in the nuclear program, that they're not immune, anyone in Iran, that the long reach of whoever did it could do it again, and so it acts as a kind of deterrence. But you know, if it were to provoke Iran into overreacting from the point of view of the U.S., and it provoked an escalatory crisis, then yes, that would make a return to diplomacy under a Biden administration that much more difficult. Imagine if Iran responded by launching an attack in Iraq against American troops, or a terrorist attack against Israel. Hard to see how a President Biden on January 21st would say, as he did in his interview with Tom Friedman, we're now jumping back into diplomacy. And Iran, too, is sending a message to the Biden administration with its decision to ramp up its nuclear program and tying it in many ways to what a Biden administration might do, whether it's prepared to relieve sanctions. So I'm sure we'll get into the detail of it, but everyone right now is maneuvering. You ask whether it has the potential of killing diplomacy. Listen, it really depends on what happens. Where we are today, I agree with you. I think the equation is the same from President Biden's perspective. The alternative is we come back into the deal, or we have a nuclear crisis with Iran. From Iran's perspective, is either we get back into compliance and have the U.S. come back into the JCPOA, or we're going to be under sanctions in a way that we really want to get out of. So the pillars of the equation haven't changed, but everything that has happened, and everything that could happen in the next 50 days could make it more complicated.
Yeah, and so let me just follow up with you on the sanctions question. So as you laid it out, the Biden administration is likely to express an interest in getting back into the JCPOA. The Iranian regime is likely to express an interest in getting back to the JCPOA so long as that means sanctions relief. The outgoing administration is putting non-nuclear sanctions in place, presumably believing that the hurdles to removing those, at least politically, if they're put on for human rights or for terrorism reasons, will be harder. So even if you get rid of the nuclear file related sanctions, you got these other ones in place, and that may have some effect. So I guess two questions. One is, do you think that's a real obstacle, or is that just sort of throwing stuff out there? I mean, is it really politically difficult to sort of parse what would be necessary in terms of sanctions? And then two, how much would that actually complicate a return to the JCPOA if you had sort of these various foundations of sanctions? And you could certainly do one, but it gets messy when you're trying to relieve other sanctions when they're explicitly tied to a nuclear agreement.
So it's a great question, and you may have said it and I missed it, but I want to make clear, I'm not speaking for the transition. I'm not speaking for anyone. This is really my own view and the view of my organization, but informed by what we read and hear. Listen, I think it makes it, that certainly has been the goal of the Trump team, and I think they've been pretty clear about it. And some of the people who support the Trump team, some organizations have made clear that by either repackaging pre-existing sanctions that had been lifted under the JCPOA as terrorism or human rights or ballistic missile related, they're saying that will make it harder for the Biden team to remove, or just adding new ones. So at one level, I think, the Biden team will have to come in and see, are any of these sanctions warranted? Prima facie, are they legitimate? The kind of sanctions that a Biden administration or Hillary Clinton administration, had she been elected, would have imposed, because let's not forget, under the JCPOA, the U.S. retained the right to impose sanctions on non-nuclear ground. So that's the question will be for the Biden administration to try to distinguish between those that are legitimate and those that are not. In some ways, I think by being as transparent as they've been, the Trump administration have done President-elect Biden a favor, because they've not hidden the fact that the reason they're imposing these sanctions is to obstruct diplomacy, is to make it harder to come back to the JCPOA. So that will make it easier, I would think, for President Biden to say, I'm lifting them precisely because these were not on the level. These were not sanctions that were imposed for legitimate reasons. They were imposed precisely for the avowed purpose of making it harder to undo what President Trump did. So yes, I'm not saying it could be done overnight, but I don't think that this is an insuperable obstacle for a return to the JCPOA.
Great. And I will just make clear again, so everyone on this call is speaking for themselves, and no one is speaking for the transition or any government or any administration. But Ilan, let me go to you and actually pick up a question that's coming from the audience from someone who has read the article that you and Elisa and Kaleigh did. I believe this is the one in Foreign Affairs in August, but recommending actions for re-engaging Iran, regardless of the administration. Now we know, well, at least most of us know what the next administration will be. A few holdouts out there, but based on, so the question is, based on current events, do you recommend any change to what you recommended? And maybe for those who have, read it, everyone else read it in August, but maybe not has it in the front of their mind. So maybe you might just remind folks what you were recommending the new administration of whatever stripe, because we didn't know back then what they would do.
Sure. Thanks, Richard. And yes, this is the article we did in Foreign Affairs. It's also based on a report that Elisa, Kaleigh, and I wrote for CNAS that we put out a couple months ago. And just to summarize, the basic argument was we're going to have a very narrow window of time from January 20th, when a new administration comes in, and June, when you're going to have elections in Iran. And so what we believed is during that time frame, what makes the most sense is to try to get some kind of an agreement with Iran to de-escalate tensions. And there's numerous options there. The argument that we made is you could either try going cleanly back into the JCPOA, both sides mutually return to the JCPOA. You can look at something that's a little bit less than the JCPOA, such as just a confidence building arrangement, as an alternative. But the key is you need to get something to kind of stabilize the situation and to really also just pull back from where we've been over the last couple of years, which is really, the Trump administration walked away from the JCPOA in May of 2018. And then in May of 2019, things really started to escalate in the region, with the tax on shipping, missile strikes on Saudi oil facilities, obviously the killing of Qasem Soleimani, now most recently the killing of Fakhrizadeh. All these things, we want to get out of this escalatory cycle during those early months. But importantly, we shouldn't stop there. We need to move just beyond the nuclear program, and then also look at a long-term approach for how you pursue the region, and also how you pursue an extension to basically a new nuclear agreement or an expansion of the current nuclear agreement, especially as sunset provisions start to come into effect. So the argument was, first, take the confidence building step before the election in the early months when frankly, look, at the end of the day, the supreme leader is the ultimate decider, not the president, not all the others around him. But, President Rouhani makes a difference. Javad Zarif, the foreign minister, makes a difference. Having a team on the Biden side who knows the team on the Iranian side, that also makes a difference. I'm sure Rob will tell you, personal relationships matter a great deal in diplomacy, and just being able to work together and having that history. All those things make sense. So we should take advantage of that narrow window. And then, once you get towards the second half of 2021, pursue an approach on the region, a broader approach on the region, and also, which involves negotiations that bring in Israel, bring in Saudi Arabia, bring in the rest of the region, start to tackle all the other questions and problems we also have with Iran. And then eventually also look at a JCPOA 2.0, where I think we have time there. The one thing I would say has changed in my mind is that I was really kind of agnostic on which approach the U.S. should take during those early months, and I still am. I tended to believe that if it was a second-term Trump administration, they were never going to go back to the JCPOA, so you'd have to do some kind of alternative de-escalatory deal. I don't know how possible that would have been. With a Biden team, I think it's more likely that you just try to do a clean return to the JCPOA. And increasingly, I'm convinced, based on what's coming out of Tehran and also out of Washington, that a simple, clean compliance for compliance arrangement is the first step. Everybody, let's go back into the JCPOA. Probably makes the most sense and is probably the easiest thing to do. Not sure I was there 6 months ago, but everything seems to be kind of pointing in that direction.
Great. I want to come back just on this sequencing question in a minute, but Elisa, let me go to you for co-author on this and can add a few things, but also in the report, the CNAS report you guys did, and the article, you talked about having kind of two negotiation tracks, one on the nuclear side and one on the, regional de-escalation. And, it's pretty easy, I think, to conceptualize at least what the negotiation track would look like on the nuclear side and what it's looked like before and how you might engage that. The regional thing is, Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Hamas and Yemen. I mean, it's big, right? And so maybe you could speak to what would a regional negotiation with Iran look like?
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to all of my friends and colleagues on the screen. It's great to be with you today, especially with you, Rob. And I think what we tried to tackle in both those pieces, and that I think continues to be the issue that needs to be tackled, is how you account for the lessons we've learned from the JCPOA experience. And one of those main lessons is, how do you deal with the regional component, the Iranian policies that destabilize the region, the concerns of partners in the region on non-nuclear issues at the same time, right? And so what we argued is that you do need to focus on this in a structured and clean way, but not naively, we know this is much more complicated. You mentioned Yemen, Syria, Lebanon. These are not problems that can be solved immediately. I think there are a couple of elements that we think are important on day one. First, that the U.S. intention is to help facilitate this dialogue and de-escalate tensions and seek to address some of these policies in a way that perhaps we did not do, certainly not in the last 4 years, but even in the immediate wake of adopting the JCPOA, right? The U.S. is not going to do this alone, right? We suggest that formulation not only includes neighbors in the region to Iran, those who have a vested interest, the P5+1, you working together. This is not a U.S. negotiation with Iran on the region. But the focus really is that U.S. diplomacy as a tool is used to shape and spur these regional dialogues toward less conflict. I think our other point is that these have to be kind of constructive, pragmatic discussions, recognizing it's going to take a while to build confidence, to lay the foundation for any kind of cooperation. So while we'd all love the instant gratification of solving Syria on day one, that kind of maximalist demand is not going to work. So we recommend in the report and have talked about in the article things like how to work together with the region on post-COVID actions, how to deal with humanitarian and medical crises, how to deal with climate change, and then move on progressively toward things like missile control and even regional nuclear arrangements, and then ultimately the protracted conflicts all over the region. But that the platform be flexible enough to start off rather modestly, but build toward some channel for honest discussion.
Great. Kaleigh, I'm going to come to you in just 1 minute, but let's go to the highlight of these sessions, I think, which is Shai Corman asking the audience what they think about some of these topics. So Shai, take it away for a second.
What's a DJ with no microphone on? I just turned it on. Well, we love having our audience participation. It's made these events so special and so interesting, and it really helps shape the conversation. We've got hundreds of people watching live right now. We are going to make our first poll question live in the chat, and the way you participate is you'll see in a moment it's a really good straightforward opening question. You'll see a vote now box appear in the chat, or a vote next to the question. And the first question is, again, it's a really straightforward one this time, and that is, Iran should be a top priority of the Biden administration. Agree or disagree? And this is really interesting because we've been doing this the fourth in our series, and in our other audiences, Iran has maybe gotten like 5% of the vote, right? When it was up against China and up against Russia as different challenges. It'll be really interesting to see this audience and how they respond with that binary choice of agree or disagree, top priority. And everyone, please vote inside the chat. There's a little voting button, and I'll be back soon with the results. Thank you, Richard. Back to you.
If someone figures out a way to write in North Korea to this question, I'll be really surprised, but it would be part of
that one guy every time.
Yeah, exactly. Kaleigh, you wanted to come in on this, the question of re-entering the JCPOA, what the merits, and what that might look like.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on Ilan's earlier point about kind of coming to this, pseudo consensus that re-entering the JCPOA is kind of the simplest option of the ones that we offered in our report. And obviously it has its advantages and disadvantages, but I do want to kind of debunk the notion that even though that may be the simplest, it is still not simple. And I think Rob alluded to this in his discussion of kind of the layers of sanctions that the Trump administration is putting on. And you alluded to with the legislation that was recently passed in Iranian parliament. Obviously, as much as people say re-entering the JCPOA could have the disadvantage of replicating the experience in 2015 and 2016. The context is that it's not 2015 and 2016, and that brings with us kind of some hopefully solutions to the challenges, but unfortunately also new challenges. So the farther, up the escalation ladder in the next 40 plus or so days that both the Iranian regime makes in terms of advancement on its nuclear program or within the region, on part of the United States, on part of other regional actors like Israel, don't necessarily make the re-entry to the JCPOA option, infeasible, but it does make it take, a greater amount of time. So how do you actually, you have to take the time to make those determination on sanctions. What are we removing? What are we keeping? And all of that is to say, once you've actually agreed with Iran on the sequencing of, are we lifting sanctions first? Or is Iran coming back into compliance first? There's the issue of Iran demands compensation, even with a clean reentry to the JCPOA. There's discussion of the fact that Iran has made some irreversible progress on its R&D. So even this kind of straightforward, policy option that Biden seems to favor comes with a whole host of questions that still need to be answered.
Great. Yeah, that's right. Let's go back to Shai and get the results, and then I'm going to hit Rob with a question here.
So we do have our results, and they are while they're close, they're definitely there must be a 0.5% in there because we're missing a number. But as you'll see, 73% of our audience think Iran should be a top priority of the Biden administration, and 26% disagree. I guess there's a 0.5% somewhere in there, but a much higher percentage than we were seeing in our other events, or at least relatively along in this series. Back to you, Richard.
Self-selecting audience as well. So I hope the 26% don't decide that they now want to just tune out. It's important nevertheless. Let me go to Rob. Let me go back to you on the sequencing question that Ilan touched on, and the Biden team has made, I think, pretty clear that their preferred option would be to go in, just to go back in, sort of compliance for compliance, without renegotiating the provisions that ultimately will need to be dealt with in some way, the sunsets, the ballistic missile provisions, things like that. Where do you come down on the sequencing of that? Because before the U.S. were to go back in, its leverage over perhaps getting change of those would seem to be higher than once you're in and Iran has gotten the sanctions relief that it wants, and you have to try to convince them down the line that it would go away again if they didn't agree to some follow-on agreement. On the other hand, there's a desire to kind of get back in the diplomatic process and start there and defer these other questions for down the line. So where do you come down on that?
Yeah, so first I want to try to help reconcile your polling results, because I think what you got the prior weeks and this week go in the same direction. I'd say Iran because Iran shouldn't be a priority, it needs to be a priority. In other words, if you don't deal with, and this kind of answers your other question, if you don't deal with the Iran nuclear issue up front, then Iran will develop its nuclear program. I mean, they've signaled it very clearly yesterday, but I would have predicted that anyway, that if the Biden administration had come in and said, no, now we want to talk about missiles, we want to talk about JCPOA 2.0, we want to do other things, you'd have immediately seen Iran dramatically ramp up its nuclear program to send the message there's a cost to not complying with international deals. And so you need to make it a priority up front in order to then put it more on the back burner as the U.S. deals with more important issues of China, climate change, et cetera. So I think both things are true. It's a priority and it isn't. So as to your question, I think as I just said, I think, yes, we would love to be able to deal with ballistic missiles, with terrorism, with destabilizing activity. President Obama would have loved to do it. I think the conclusion he reached, and I think it was the right one, and I think it would apply today, is those are going to take a long time because they have to do with Iran's defense strategy, its own threat perception. It has to do with the whole balance of power in the region. So let's at least get this nuclear issue off the table, or it's going to come back and we're going to have to deal with it sooner or later by military means or otherwise. So I think it still remains the case. And when I read Tom Friedman's column, and he then interviewed President-elect Biden, and he argues, use this leverage, and you asked that question. President Trump has been trying to use that leverage for the past 4 years. And what we've seen is that Iran, and this is another question I see on your chat box, one of the questions is whether Iran has come closer to a bomb. Now, I don't, forget about whether they are actually seeking a bomb or not. Their nuclear program has advanced over the last 4 years. Their regional behavior has become more destabilizing over the past 4 years. During the period during which the Trump administration put in place maximum pressure, therefore maximum leverage, if you will. So I don't see how anyone could reasonably think that if President Biden came in tomorrow and said, sorry, we're not going back into the JCPOA. We're going to double down on the maximum pressure campaign, use that leverage to get Iran to make concessions on missiles and other issues. How anyone thinks that's going to work? At a minimum, you'd see months during which Iran would double down on its nuclear program, perhaps double down on its regional activities in order to reinstate their part of the leverage. So I'm always at a loss as to how people assume that strategy would work unless you're prepared to live with what President Obama was not prepared to live with, and I'm not sure President Biden would be prepared to live with, which is Iran accelerating its nuclear program and coming closer to crossing that threshold, whatever it may be. So I would still be of the view, put the nuclear problem as much as you can in the freezer, in the box, deal with the other issues, and they're going to be immensely complicated. I mean, the notion that we're going to reach a deal on ballistic missiles without touching on other parts of the security architecture of the region, that is probably illusory. And to deal with Syria and Yemen and Libya, and we'll not forget about Libya, but Iraq, et cetera, that also is going to be very hard because it has to do with the balance of power between the regional actors. I think we need to try to do it. We need to focus hard on that, but let's not hold the nuclear part of the deal hostage to those efforts.
So even though if you cabin the nuclear files, even leave out ballistic missiles, you just focus on the sunsets. You don't think there's a case for using the leverage before reentry to try to get an extension of the sunsets? And the second question would be, if pressure won't get extension of the sunsets, are we stuck with the sunsets forever? So, by definition, pressure is not going to move around on this.
The sunsets was a huge part of what held up the negotiations, how many years ago when we were in Vienna. I mean, it wasn't sort of an afterthought. It was an issue on which, as you know, Iran took a very different view about how long it should take. And, we started at one point, they started another point, and we ended up somewhere in the middle. I just believe that if you come back and tell Iran we're renegotiating the JCPOA, we're going to use our leverage to get this deal, we're going to have months and months of a potential nuclear crisis. Now, I don't know why we'd be worse off to say we're coming back into this deal and immediately thereafter negotiating a, whatever you want to call it, a part of which would be our demand, request, whatever it is, that the sunsets be extended, or however you want to phrase it. Iran is going to put other things on the table too. It's going to put the primary embargo on the table, and we're going to have to see what we're prepared to do in order to address the issue of sunsets. They're not going to agree to extending the sunsets or not having these open-ended restrictions without us putting something very significant on the table. That's going to be up to the Biden administration to decide. But that's not going to be done quickly. It was a huge stumbling block in 2015. And the Iranians won't give it up easily. They won't give it up for free. Let's at least, that issue will come later. It's not even a first Biden administration term issue. It's the second term of whoever the president will be at that point. So we have some time to deal with it. And my last point, and I think Ilan made it in some event where I heard him say this, and I think it's very accurate. It's not as if the U.S. doesn't have leverage, even if it agrees to remove the sanctions that were reimposed by President Trump. The one thing the Trump administration proved, maybe overproved it, was that the U.S. has infinite ability to reimpose sanctions unilaterally and to do a lot of harm to Iran. So I don't think that we do away with our leverage. Our leverage is always there if we want to use it. The question is using it smartly, using it realistically for goals that we think are achievable.
Great. Ilan, I know you want to come in on this question, but let me also extend it to go back to this dual track diplomacy that you've recommended on the regional track. And so there's kind of two parts of the question. One follows right on Rob's. What do you think the U.S. should put on the table, either in terms of pressure or carrots, in order to get some satisfaction of what we would like to see out of Iran on the regional issues? And then two, starting with Elisa's, I think very correct thing that we wouldn't get everything we want. What would be the priorities in the region? I mean, where would we start if we wanted Iran to stop doing X or to start doing Y? What would we seek?
Sure. And then I'm going to just first, Richard, echo a couple of points that Rob made, and especially this idea of leverage, right? I mean, look, to have a negotiation, yes, you need leverage in a negotiation. You also need to have somebody on the other end of the table who believes a word that's coming out of your mouth and will actually have that discussion with you. And I think we've probably erred too far into the leverage category, and there just is no way back into this without actually returning to something that, frankly, we promised we would do for years, right? And as Rob pointed out, and I said this before, and others did, and actually Vice President or President-elect Biden kind of intimated it during his interview with Tom Friedman, which is, at the end of the day, we get to 2030 and there is not a world where we get to 2030 and the sunsets expire and Iran just goes off and does whatever it wants with no sanctions. Because forget what a Biden administration wants to do or a Trump administration wants to do. There is not a world where Congress says, okay, like we're not reimposing the sanctions. Like it just doesn't exist. So we don't have to be the ones out there threatening it. Like everybody knows that's kind of true. And I think the Iranians kind of realize that. We don't have to rub their face in it or insist on getting things for it now, especially since we won't. More directly, Richard, on your question, in terms of like what we actually look for in the region. Look, I actually think, I like doing all the sort of COVID-19 and the environment and all that stuff's nice, but that stuff's not going to really move the needle at the end. I mean, it's good to establish ties, but where do we actually start to tackle challenges? I'd argue one idea I've thrown out there before is maybe you can get the Gulf states and the Iranians to start by agreeing to not interfere in each other's internal affairs, which is, forget Syria or Yemen for a moment. Let's talk about the fact that, Iran still supports various actors in eastern Saudi Arabia or Bahrain. The Gulf states still support various groups like the MEK. Of course, they all deny these things, but they're both doing stuff that drives the other side crazy, but also, frankly, that has very little strategic utility. So I would hope they'd be willing to give some of those things up, right? These like separatist groups inside of Iran, like that's not the play here. I mean, there's not a world where like that causes regime collapse and overthrow of the government. So, maybe they can both start tamping things like that down, or at least sign some kind of an agreement that says that how you implement that, like whether they actually fully abide by it, whether you can enforce it, all good questions, but at least you tamp down tensions and start to move in a positive direction. I'd argue that naval de-escalation is another area where maybe you can set something up. We've tried in the past to set up a channel between the U.S. and Iran on naval de-escalation. The Iranians have been not that interested, partially because you can't really find an IRGC Navy officer who would see it as a career, like helping move, pick up the phone and talk to the NAVCENT commander. Like it's just, like the bureaucratics of that doesn't work. But let's say you had, I don't know, a French or British or one of our other partners, Australian officer sitting next to the NAVCENT commander a room over, and that person could pick up and talk to the phone on the other side. Like maybe you can try to set something multilateral up. Like there's different ways of doing things here to at least start like tamping things down. And then you start to get to some of the harder stuff, And I actually think probably out of all the conflicts, look, they're all going to be brutally difficult to solve. And as Kaleigh pointed out, even returning to the JCPOA is going to be hard, right? Like it's not going to be easy, but the one thing I'll say is it's going to be a lot easier than it was in 2013 or 15 when everybody's kind of like wandering in the dark and there was no clear pathway. Like we do have a pretty clear pathway on the nuclear question, which also I think gives us as the US government the ability to think a lot more about the regional questions. Look, I wasn't part of that team, Rob was, but they worked really, 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 really hard just on the nuclear question. They were trying to do regional issues too, but it's hard. There's bandwidth issues come into play too. In a world where the nuclear issue is more straightforward and easier, you can also put more energy, creativity, and political will into the regional questions. So, and of all the regional conflicts, I'd probably say Yemen is probably the most ripe for progress or resolution, but God, they're all hard. I mean, they're all like, nothing is easy in that space at all.
Elisa, I know you've got a couple thoughts, but I want to also pull in a couple audience questions that have come in and just ask if these are a little speculative here. So, if Iran chose not to go back into the JCPOA, would the Biden administration be willing to unilaterally act against Iran via sanctions or military force? And then there's a separate question, but related, about, kinetic and cyber actions to permanently eliminate that program. And I think maybe that's a question even more before you even get to the wisdom of such a thing, the feasibility of that. So maybe you can touch on those two.
Sure. I want to make one quick point on leverage, and then happy to at least start answering that question. I agree with everything that Ilan and Rob said about leverage. I think The one thing I would add, though, and the dimension that I think requires some thinking, is that the reality is we're dealing with the same leverage, the same incentives to address both the nuclear and the non-nuclear interests, right? And so when we think about how to construct an approach, it has to keep in mind that we've got the same pie, so to speak, to engage on both fronts. And something that Ilan and Kaleigh and I and other colleagues have discussed that's worth repeating here is that Iran assesses these incentives and interests differently than the US side does. And so thinking through kind of those scenarios, I think, are incredibly useful as we talk about the first order steps in an immediate return or not, and then certainly the long-term steps on a follow-on agreement on the nuclear front, but also any kind of dialogue and negotiation on non-nuclear issues. On the question of what a Biden administration should or should not do if Iran chooses not to readopt the JCPOA, and it is speculative because technically Iran is still in the JCPOA. It's not in compliance with all its provisions, but unlike the United States, it hasn't withdrawn. So the scenario is not exactly what we're dealing with right now. But I think I can safely say that a Biden administration, like the Obama administration, has all the authorities it needs to take actions with respect to additional sanctions, whether on the nuclear front or on the non-nuclear front, whether that be terrorism related, whether it be human rights related. So, and I'm sure that Congress would be more than happy to help supplement those as necessary in the event that Iran chose to do something dramatic like withdraw from the JCPOA and in fact start violating other provisions of its agreements on non-proliferation. So I think the space is there to do that. I'm not going to speculate on the use of force, but I think there are all kinds of tools that an administration, and certainly the Biden administration when they took office, has available in the scenario that this question presents.
Rob, I know you have a point you want to make on leverage. Let me throw into that, if you don't mind, a question about Israel and Netanyahu, who's already saying don't go back in. We all remember how this worked out in the Obama administration, including the speech to Congress and the kind of frostiness that helped produce between the two governments. I mean, is that the kind of environment that you think the Biden administration is likely to go into if it goes back in the JCPOA, or do you think this is, I don't know, a less full-throated kind of objection and more pro forma? I guess I'm trying to think about, is one of the things that the Biden administration you think about as a replay of the sort of Netanyahu-Obama dynamic post, JCPOA that took place, a few years ago.
So I'll answer that, then I want to come back very briefly to the question of leverage. I mean, I think there's a difference. We've gone through that past period, and I'm not sure anyone wants to repeat it. And I think the relationship between President Biden and Netanyahu is not the same as between President Obama and Netanyahu. I'm not surprised that Netanyahu said what he did. As Gulf countries are saying, I would hope that they will have taken, and that's why I think it was important for President-elect Biden to say what he said in his Friedman interview, to lay it out clearly. I said it during the campaign. I'm now saying it as president-elect. That's my goal. That's what I'm going to try to do if Iran is prepared to go down that path. And then the choice will be for Israel, for Saudi Arabia, for others. Do they then want to work with the U.S. on what comes after and on coordinating policies towards Iran, or are they prepared to poison that atmosphere for the sake of trying to obstruct then President Biden doing what he said he was going to do, and a mandate on which he was elected? I mean, he was very clear about it before the election. That's the platform that the American people chose. I want to make one point about leverage because, part of our professional deformation, maybe at Crisis Group, is we try to put ourselves in other people's shoes all the time. So we've been speaking about, is the U.S. is it going to waste its leverage? I think there's something as too much leverage. And I think the Trump administration may have actually bequeathed to his successor too much leverage in the following sense. If you're an Iranian negotiator or decision maker and you're asked to go through this again, in other words, we're going to undo some of our nuclear program, we're going to ship out or downblend our enriched uranium, we're going to destroy some of the centrifuges, knowing that in a year, 2 years, 4 years, if President Cruz or President Trump is back in the White House, that the sanctions will come back and everything we will have gained will be lost. Knowing also that if you're a foreign company, are you going to invest in Iran knowing that a few years down the road, sanctions may be reimposed. So I think the U.S. may have overproven its power to the point where that leverage can't really produce what you want, because Iran is going to question how reliable and how durable that commitment will be. I think that's going to be a real question that I'm sure the first meeting between Iran and the U.S. will be. How do we know that this won't happen again? What assurances can you give? And we know the answer. We can't give you any assurance.
Great. Kaleigh, I want to come to you in a second, but I want to go to Shai just quickly, and he can tee up our next poll question.
So on the question of what the Biden administration should do in the first 100 days, I think all of our speakers have weighed in on this. Now it is time for the audience to weigh in. Again, to all the folks that are watching, the poll is now open in the chat. Within the first 100 days, the administration should seek to reduce tensions, or should it, here we go, seek to reduce tensions or continue to put pressure on Iran to build more leverage? Again, the voting in the chat is open right now. Please let yourself be heard, and I'll be back in a bit with the results. Back to you, Richard.
I really do think this is Shai's favorite part of the week. It's just, something to behold. All right. So Kaleigh, I want to ask you two questions, and then others I'm sure may have some thoughts on this as well. And it actually gets back to Rob's point on reliability. And I think of reliability in two ways that I want to ask about. One is reliability with the other partners. So, we have over the past decade had Treasury officials going to Europe saying, don't do business with Iran. We're trying to build up sanctions. Then we had the deal. Treasury officials go over and say, do business with Iran. They need to see a return on investment and diplomatic investment. Then Trump comes in. Then Treasury officials go back and say, no, actually don't do business with Iran because we're doing maximum pressure. If we go back to the JCPOA, presumably we will encourage our partners once again to, are we in danger of being seen as, shall we say, mercurial? And not listen to when it comes to the sort of business and the economics that would flow from what the US's latest position is. And it kind of related to that is this question of Congress. Is there any chance that this will get anything? I mean, you don't need another vote in Congress if they go back in, but just from a political sustainability perspective, is there any chance that you will have anything other than most Democrats saying this is a good step and all Republicans saying that it's not?
Yeah, on the kind of business economic side of reliability, I do think that we've, basically shown the world that we can be quite mercurial. And so you'll have many businesses who are keeping an eye, which is why, Europe's efforts while we were still out of the JCPOA to kind of try to create space where US sanctions weren't quite threatening all of those trade relationships could still continue even in light of re-entry. I think in addition to that, Iran will be watching how the United States is communicating not just about kind of the relief package that it's putting together as far as JCPOA re-entry, but when we begin those discussions of what a follow-on agreement looks like, they're really going to be asking for, a real step up in economic incentives, because just like we've had kind of these past experiences, they've learned a lot of lessons from the JCPOA, 1.0 original experience as well. And so they know especially what to ask for. There's no kind of, we can promise that this is going to give you, this much economic growth. They're going to have a better idea of exactly what they need from the United States. So we're going to have to make sure that we're actually willing to make those kinds of concessions. In terms of the role that Congress can play, and I think this is also a question that the audience has kind of brought up, is what role do they have to play, both in de-escalation and in kind of, securing the viability of re-entering the JCPOA. I think you will potentially kind of see generally the same split as before. I think given, Iran's posturing and the threat that may become more immediate of its advancement towards a weapon, especially if we're nearing kind of an election that could bring in a more hardline power within Iran, could put pressure on some to kind of say, okay, this is the first step we have to take. But I think more concerningly is Iran will be watching what's happening in the United States. That's another lesson that they've learned, is to look at our domestic politics and see, the rhetoric that's happening here at home as an indicator of the viability of the deal to make sure the experience is not repeated. I think a way that that Biden could try to kind of combat some of those risks is to really kind of message from the beginning and to seek to build buy-in, especially from Republican, caucuses on the Hill. So, I think one of the ideas that we offered in our August report was establishing, like a gang of 8 or involving them, in future negotiations, as has happened with past arms control, I think in the 80s. So there are options. We don't have to exactly replay what happened before, but that is kind of, the path we're headed down.
Great. Ilan, I want to come to you in a second. Let's get the results of our poll, because I don't want Shai chomping at the bit too long here.
I was already ready. Now, I what's interesting here is, so we had 70+% who thought Iran was a top priority, but there is some disagreement among our group in the group watching as to how we should be dealing with Iran. As you can see here, we've got 69% who would like to reduce tensions, and 30% would like to build leverage. Now, that was bouncing back and forth between the high 60s and low 30s, high 20s, depending on it. But you see, there's a little bit of a gap between the amount of people who want this to be a high priority and how we should actually be dealing with this.
We still have 1% that's spoiling their ballot or something. So
yeah, it's the guy who's voting for North Korea.
So we're gonna, you know what? There could be fraudulence in the election in the CNAS polling. That's just a joke for anybody who's too literal minded today. All right, Ilan, let me go to you, particularly on this Congress question. And so many times I've heard since JCPOA, well, if it only had been a treaty, then it would sort of stick, right? Because you get 2/3, all that stuff. So leave aside whether a treaty could have been actually approved by the Senate with 2/3. Just leave that aside. It's never, having spent an inordinate amount of time of my life working in the Senate, it's never been clear to me that the politics flows from the treaty status, in the sense that, or that it sticks longer, right? So, George W. Bush walked out of the ABM treaty unilaterally. It was a treaty. Unsigned the Treaty of Rome, hadn't been ratified, but it was a treaty. Trump INF treaty. It's not like the Congress said, oh my God, you're taking away our prerogative. We ratified that by 2/3 majority. We're going to somehow tie your hands and make it unable or politically very difficult for you to do that. It's basically you bow to the executive prerogative. So it's never been clear to me that it sticks in the executive branch longer if it's treaty status, however desirable that may be from a constitutional perspective or whatever else. But maybe you can speak to first of all, if I'm wrong, let me know, but the politics of this going forward, because, is the betting of other countries, well, if the U.S. re-enters sometime in 2021, the clock starts ticking down until the next presidential election.
I mean, the politics are hard, very hard, Richard. And I'd also be interested to get your perspective as a guy who spent, a fair amount of time up on the Hill. Look, I do think one of the challenges we have is the JCPOA itself is just tarred with this whole history of the debate, right? And so this is one of the reasons I thought, hey, in the beginning, maybe it'd be better if we don't go back to the JCPOA and instead we have some kind of, smaller agreement at first. It's called something else, and that was part of the reason that some of those ideas were in our first report. But increasingly, I'm just convinced it's not a very viable option. I mean, it's just too complicated to do in 6 months. The Iranians have signaled no interest in it whatsoever. Maybe if we can't get back into the JCPOA because of the complications Kaleigh talked about, you can go there. But even then once you reopen it and you're doing something different, all kinds of new questions could potentially come on the table. So I think you're kind of stuck with going back into the JCPOA as the confidence building measure that makes the most sense early. And that does put you behind the 8 ball in Congress. Because there's a lot of baggage associated with the whole debate in 2015. So you got to deal with it. One way to deal with it is to then make a serious effort at all the other issues. A lot of the justification and objections have to do with concerns about the regional issues. So, Biden administration has, 4 years to make progress there. And if it does, and if it could demonstrate that it's actually moving the ball in some of these other questions, if it could demonstrate, maybe that it's moving the ball on sunsets, though I tend to agree with Rob, the important sunsets don't really roll in until 2030, so I don't think it's as pressing. Maybe over time you can build that political support. Maybe part of it is also what Kaleigh talked about, a more inclusive process. Maybe also, and this I think is important, this is the first presidential campaign that I can remember, at least in my active adult, professional doing this lifetime, where the Middle East was not the first foreign policy issue on the agenda, right? It's really about China, COVID, other things. So this issue just might get less important in the overall political debate. And as it does, it might get less political, and there might be more space over time, especially in a world where you can make the case that unless we figure this out, like it's gonna be a lot harder to deal with the China challenge. And so maybe you can start to make that case, and maybe just this becomes less of a political lightning rod if you're successful at over time bringing the Israelis and the Saudis in, especially the Israelis. Like, they don't drive decisions on the Hill, but they matter on the Hill. Their voice definitely matters. And so, I think most likely you're going to have, an early return to the JCPOA with 100% Republican opposition to it. But then can you, over time, over the next 3 or 4 years, start to change minds, make this less of a radioactive issue? No nuclear pun intended, and try to build that consensus.
Unfortunately, I'm pessimistic. And in part, I think this all started with the way the vote was structured in Congress, because when the president came out and said he would veto any amendments that frustrated the object of the agreement, and therefore you would have to have a 2/3 vote to override a veto. So what it meant was every Republican could vote against the agreement, express opposition to the agreement, and the agreement was going to go in place anyway. There was no amount of votes that the Republicans on their own could take that would do this. And so in a sense, it's a free vote. So if you have qualms about the agreement, you can express those qualms, particularly if you got a president of a different party and things like that. And so, I don't know. I'd love to be more optimistic about the prospects for bipartisan approach to Iran, but this seems to be one of those that's particularly difficult. Elisa, I'm going to come to you in just 1 second, but we have our last poll question, so let's just do that real fast.
All right, we have our last poll, and this one, now we had a lot of A or B options. Now we have room for nuance here. So there's room for nuance here. Regarding Iran's nuclear program, the Biden administration should pursue, and you'll see this in the chat when you click vote, because we don't have room for all of these words on the screen, should A, re-enter the JCPOA, B, go for a new, more comprehensive agreement, pursue a new, more comprehensive agreement, a more limited interim agreement, or no deal, maintain maximum pressure. And I'm seeing the votes pouring in now already. And I think I won't spoil anything. I'd love to hear some predictions as to what the audience thinks, but it is far more, like I said, nuanced than the A/B answers we've had so far. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Richard.
All right, Elisa, let me go to you, because I know you want to come in on this on the role that our regional Arab partners can play.
Yeah, I also want to answer the poll, and Iran gets a vote too, although it's probably not going to be reflected in the poll, right? And that's one of the things that Rob and Ilan and Kaleigh have all commented on. But when you look at the signaling, it's quite clear that a straight return to compliance on both sides is where they're headed. And what does that mean for regional partners? I think you're inevitably going to see the familiar anxieties and the concerns that we've seen before and have heard before with respect to resumption of the U.S. role in the JCPOA. But I think as we all know and have talked about in various ways, it's really about the kind of attendant consequences, right? The U.S. engagement with Iran at all, and what that means for power dynamics in the region. But what has happened over the last 18 or so months is that regional partners have found themselves kind of in the crosshairs of what that escalatory cycle looks like, and being that front line against Iranian retaliation. And that's not exactly where they want to be either. And so there, I think, is where our concepts of this kind of regional framework of some kind that we've talked about in our papers really comes to play, right? Because you saw these partners reaching out to Iran directly in the aftermath of some of the escalation last year. You've seen partners in the region come out in the aftermath of the assassination and condemning it. So, these are signals that some kind of diplomatic dialogue can help to really solidify again, won't resolve every issue, won't be easy, but it does help to provide some face saving on all sides. And it does continue to signal like the US interest and commitment to the region, even if it's not the same as it's been in the past, even if it isn't the top foreign policy issue, that, you know, I'm going to borrow a line that we have all heard probably dozens of times. And that is, what happens in the Middle East rarely stays in the Middle East, right? So we do have an interest in stability, in de-escalation, in lower levels of conflict in the Middle East. And to the extent that, you know, we can compel partners to work together with us and with others to do that, you know, I think there's some room there, and it will take that concerted diplomatic effort though, and it's not glamorous, but it has to be focused and deep in terms of commitment.
Great. Let's go back to Shai for our results here.
All right. So do you want to guess what was number one in the poll, or should I just bring up the results?
Just bring it right out.
All right. We've got 41% say we should re-enter the JCPOA, 26% a new, more comprehensive agreement, 14% a more limited interim agreement, and only 17% want no deal and to maintain maximum pressure. So I think once we injected a little bit of nuance, it's really interesting to see where the audience has dispersed. And I want to say, before I go back into my producer cave, thank you to our fantastic audience, hundreds of votes voting and chatting and participating in this event. And that's part of what helps and make these such fun conversations. Back to you, Richard.
Great. We're just about at time, but Rob, let me ask you just the last question here. And this actually comes back to where we started, which is the transition. We still got a few weeks left between now and inauguration. Obviously, we've seen the assassination of the nuclear scientist, the continued effort on sanctions. You watch crises for a living. So in your head, are there other serious possibilities of something that could exacerbate U.S.-Iranian relations over the next few weeks that would constrain or attempt to constrain the Biden administration as it comes in beyond the stuff that we've already seen? I mean, theoretically, of course, yes, of course, things are possible. But is it your sense that, you know, we sort of settle down and kind of head on out, or is it just you can't say what?
Listen, I've been thinking now for a long time that this period is the period of maximum danger, because you do have, partly it's to I think to tie President-elect Biden's hands, but it's also an opportunity for countries maybe very legitimately believe that a President Biden is going to be too soft on Iran. This is their time to push back and to tuck in as much, squeeze as much as they can in the remaining time, whether it's assassinations, whether it's cyber attacks, whether it's attacks against Hezbollah. I mean, you know, you can imagine that, a whole host of things that some countries in the region and perhaps the Trump administration think it's now or never. And if we don't do it, President Biden is going to be way too soft. So I think it's extremely fraught. You know, in some ways, the decision Iran took yesterday, maybe that buys them even in some the luxury of not responding to other things. Maybe, you know, all they'll say is we already responded and we're going to continue on this path. But I do worry that things could happen, because for both, you know, as I said, either it's because they don't want Biden to go back in, or because they know he will, and they want to make sure that Iran is as weak as possible when that day comes.
Well, the only thing that got all four of you nodding your heads at the same time was your comment that this is the period of maximum danger. So at least there seems to be consensus, although I don't know how we should feel about that. But let's end it there. Rob, Ilan, Kaleigh, Elisa, thank you for speaking today. Thanks to the audience once again for joining us. We'll continue to do these events as issues come up and we sort of think about what we have to come in this new political era. And so once again, thanks to everybody for joining us, and appreciate your time and have a great day.